What happens when a vicious clown tries to rule the road? The 4-lane car wreck that we will be responding to on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we review Kipp Davis's January 2nd, 2022 blog about me and my scholarship. Now, normally I use minimal notes when I do a video. However, given the precision necessary for today's response, I am reading a prepared script, which will be linked in the description along with a link to Kipp's blog. So if my eyes aren't looking into the camera, that's what's going on. And this is okay because academic papers are often done this way. And besides, Kipp does this frequently, which is why you get his, quote, up-the-nose camera view. Now, generally, I don't have a problem with atheists. Atheists, Christians, Muslims, pagans, and Martians are all welcome on my channel. But I believe the implications of today's topic go far beyond a small dispute over the meaning of Deuteronomy 32:8-9. Kipp's blog was intended to drive me out of the discussion of religion. If I, as a scholar with theological credentials, can be driven out of the marketplace of ideas because I hold a PhD and a faith commitment, no pastor or minister is safe. Being a Bible scholar means you have a qualified opinion, but it doesn't give you an exclusive right to own any opinion on the Bible. Likewise, being an Egyptologist means you have a qualified opinion, but it does not give me an exclusive right to own any opinion about ancient Egypt. Kipp is advancing an arrogant position that only the elite can have an opinion, a monolithic secular voice. But while Kipp is singling out those with a faith commitment, anyone, including atheists, can be the target of this elitism. It is a freedom of speech, conscience, and religion matter as much as anything. Those freedoms are worth fighting for, and I will defend your right to free speech, even if I think you're wrong. For those new to my channel, or for whom this is their first exposure to my content, I essentially run a small educational ministry that caters to people of faith, regardless of their faith. I defend historic Christianity because I think that point of view is reasonable. So if you are an atheist, I'm glad for you and hope it works for you. So I usually have a live and let live attitude. But I have a deep disgust for those who bully educated Christians out of religious discussions in order to prey on, quote, nervous evangelicals, end quote. The Apostle Paul said, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after them. These threats to the flock are both within the church and, quote, come in from the outside. I'm not seeking to convert the atheist, but Kipp Davis and Josh Bowen are seeking to convert the Christian. The, quote, nervous evangelical, end quote, is the target of Kipp's efforts. So they are the savage wolves predating upon the Christian. The same way a pack of wolves stalks a herd of elk by picking off the young and the weak. Bowen and Davis have this good cop, bad cop routine going when both are bad cops. Bowen has spent years developing friendships with a large network of the gullible, placating them into silence as he corrodes and undermines the faith of the weak. His strategy has been highly effective with those who value nice over the faith. However, if you shine the faintest light upon the facade the real Josh is exposed. He crawls back under his rock, and his good buddy, Kipp Davis, rushes to his aid with a hit-and-run campaign. Now, these nice guys of atheism are deploying intimidation tactics to silence educated religious views, so they can ride roughshod over people of faith without challenge. Their tactics are no different than any elementary school bully, and their discourse is about as sophisticated. So how did we get here? Today's response is the next step in a long exchange of events. It all started with an interview of Josh Bowen saying scholars with faith are biased and shouldn't be in the biblical discourse. This was followed by a popcorn review that I did to that video. See the link above. This was followed by a disastrous dumpster fire review of my popcorn video by Kipp, Pat Lowinger, and the gullible Patsy Oz. This, at the same time, a simultaneous live stream response by me, Robert Rowe, and an illustrious cast of many responded to that dumpster fire. Then, in one of my live streams, one of my subscribers, SwiftC, gave me an off-the-cuff question, which I answered to. Following this, Kipp, Bowen, and Dan McClellan cherry-picked from that live stream to respond to my, quote, scholarship. This was followed by a disingenuous question posted on my YouTube comments section that parroted some of the arguments and mannerisms from that previous video. And we'll just call that viewer Kipp's Loser Sycophant. That's not his real name, but we're just going to call him that. This was followed by my answer to that YouTube comment, which was then followed by a written blog response by Kipp saying that an educated person of faith should not be in the biblical discourse that he posted on the Amateur Exegete. And then finally, my response to that blog, which is this video right here. To be clear, over this chain of events, the core issue remains unchanged. The entire issue is over who should be allowed to offer an opinion on the Bible. Kipp believes that uneducated buffoons like R.N. Raw should comment on the Bible, but I should, quote, stay in my lane, end quote. It is a ridiculous and dangerous double standard. Additionally, under a veneer of so-called scholarship, Kipp has made several defamatory remarks about me and my teaching that need to be addressed. And whether or not Kipp has a vendetta is irrelevant to his claims. So we are going to examine the claims he made on the Amateur Exegete, a secular blog hostile to the Bible and Bible believers, to expose his claims for what they are. However, Kipp makes one claim about me that's not on the blog that he repeats often enough, which he uses to poison the well. He has claimed several times to his sycophants and my supporters alike, quote, in contrast to Bowen, Falk is still a fundamentalist, end quote. I am not, and have never been, a fundamentalist. Even a cursory review of my channel would indicate that. I am a person of faith that subscribes to no ecclesiastical formulation other than historic, essential Christianity. If that makes me a fundamentalist, then so is the Pope, and the Ayatollah is a Jew. Now, I'm going to forego most of the Amateur Exegete's puffery and get right to the meat. However, I think some of the Amateur Exegete's words will come back to haunt him. Particularly, quote, Davis demonstrates what I find to be the hallmarks of good scholarship. measured language, knowledge of and appreciation for other scholars in the field, a desire for truth. I heartily commend this post to you, readers, as it was my distinct privilege to be asked to do this on Dr. Davis's behalf. Suffice it to say that the amateur exegete will be shown to either be a poor judge of character, a poor judge of scholarship, or both. While Kipp certainly has the credentials to discuss the Hebrew Bible intelligently, he also plays fast and loose with the facts. He omits certain facts about me that would cast a different light upon what he states in his blog. It is true that my PhD is in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool. However, Kipp omits that Liverpool is the top school in my field, and that I did my PhD research on ritual processional furniture as a context study for the biblical Ark of the Covenant. In short, my PhD was in a field that integrated biblical studies, and my dissertation was published with Hendrickson's publishers in the field of biblical studies. I have also published book chapters and articles on the Book of Exodus, biblical archaeology, ancient lexicography, ancient ritual, and new religious movements. I am also a full member of several professional societies that do work in biblical studies: the American Society of Overseas Research, the Evangelical Theological Society, and the Society for Biblical Literature. I also hold 3 master's degrees, which are in Egyptology, biblical archaeology, and divinity, which is the professional degree for pastoral ministry. And I currently hold a research affiliation at a liberal graduate level theological college, where I conduct research on the ancient Near East and the origins of early Israelite culture. So when Kipp says in his title, why David A. Falk should refrain from impersonating a biblical scholar on YouTube, he commits prima facie libel. Questions regarding the quality of my research notwithstanding, since that remains to be determined, whether Kipp likes it or not, I am a biblical scholar. No pretending is involved. But as seen so far, slander and libel seem to be second nature to him. That alone makes me doubt Amateur Exegete's judgment that Kipp has any sort of, quote, desire for truth, end quote. Kipp is all about making hit pieces, since he is intellectually lazy, preferring straw over steel men. Even his photo of me is the most unflattering frame Kipp could select from video footage. But that's okay, since Kipp looks fetching in clown makeup. Now, let's get to the blog itself. And I quote Kipp, "The reason Drs. Bowen, McClellan, and I set out to do the short review was because the presenter in the stream, Dr. David A. Falk, provided a response that not only ignored the crucial textual evidence for the passage, but demonstrated he had little or no idea about the ongoing scholarly discussion behind its history of transmission." The live stream he's responding to was my live stream number 30, Full Moon on Saturday, where Swiftsy asked the question, "I've heard Mark S. Smith say that Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 is evidence that Old Testament religion was polytheistic because it says that the god El gave Israel to Yahweh. What are your thoughts on this argument?" It is important to note that I do not receive the questions in advance. This is a live show. I don't look things up in a commentary prior to answering. In such a format, I do my best to answer the question as best as possible given the time restraints. I will sometimes answer as many as 30 questions in a 2-hour segment. That roughly provides 4 minutes per question. For that particular question by SwiftC, 6 minutes were allocated. But suffice it to say that there is no way to answer every question with fully fleshed answers under these conditions. Of course, that's part of the fun and excitement of a live Q&A stream, is that nobody knows what's going to be asked or the direction the answers will take. Moreover, out of that 2-hour segment, Kipp cherry-picked 2 live answers to determine my fitness as a biblical scholar. Since when are live Q&As the standard to judge anyone's scholarship? Trial by social media. Every academic knows that the gold standard for evaluating scholarship is their written, published work, not their live, off-the-cuff remarks. This is just sleazy. Kipp continues, quote, "This is poor scholarship, especially when it is dressed up in the guise of authority, as Falk is known to do." Kipp means that only those with an esoteric specialist knowledge have any sort of authority to comment on the Bible. Yet, this is something pastors and preachers do every day, and should do since it is their job. Of course, the definition of, quote, scholarship is quite vague. However, it is agreed that it is high-level study or research conducted at a school or institution of higher learning. It is a stretch to claim one can have, quote, scholarship, let alone poor scholarship, when giving off-the-cuff answers on YouTube. While my scholarship informs what I do on YouTube, YouTube is a poor medium for scholarship. YouTube only supplies what is better known as cocktail party knowledge. Party knowledge is when a professional gives informal answers to questions. This is why physicians are not liable for any medical advice given at a cocktail party, because there is no expectation that a physician at a party knows your entire case history or has read all the relevant medical texts. It is like going to a barbecue chicken place and demanding beef. Then you complain that they only serve chicken. It's a barbecue chicken joint, stupid. Likewise, complaining that a YouTube livestream Q&A is not serving scholarship is irrational and absurd. If you want real scholarship, go read a book. In fact, I'd recommend that Kipp go and read a book anyway. He's making us look stupid here. Now, he continues, quote, he, meaning me, now makes Christian apologetics videos on YouTube, end quote. We actually make educational videos that cover the areas of the Bible and Egypt from a Christian perspective. That is not the same as making apologetics videos. Apologetics is a broad field that covers theology, philosophy, and church history with the end goal to evangelize. Philosophy and church history are not our focus, and we certainly don't evangelize. And while there is some overlap between what we do and what some apologists do, we also cover topics that have no faith basis. Recent archaeological finds, the basics of ancient languages and linguistics, and general Egyptian history and culture. People of all faiths are welcome on our channel and are allowed to contribute in the comments. It would be similar to calling the channel Kipp Davis fundamentalist because Kipp makes videos about the Bible. Kipp is essentially confirming a cognitive bias and falsely insinuating guilt by association. So much for amateur exegetes' estimation of, quote, balanced measures. Now, Kipp in his response takes a four-pronged attack upon my informal written response to the loser sycophant's comment. Let's start with the first. Quote, first, we shall consider the disclaimer he added to his video, which essentially reveals that Falk is disingenuously disseminating information about topics he really knows little or nothing about. Let's examine the disclaimer in question and see what it actually says. And I quote, as a reminder, it is important to realize that when I answer questions on my live streams, that I do them as a live show, generally without notes or prior preparation. I also don't normally get the questions in advance, so I don't even know which questions I'm going to receive, and nobody screens the questions. So I don't necessarily promise that any question will flesh out every last detail or reference all the literature on the subject. Nor do I necessarily hold that all the answers are even necessarily correct. I do make mistakes at times, and sometimes my opinions change when I receive new data that points to the contrary. My answers are intended to address the direct inquiry and are not a substitute for a sound biblical commentary. Is this an admittal that I am, quote, disingenuously disseminating information about topics I really know little or nothing about? Hardly. It is a disclaimer reflecting the realities of live broadcasting. My disclaimer is an acknowledgement that mistakes are sometimes made, and answers may not be fully complete, and are not a substitute for a more complete, scholarly expository understanding that is found in a biblical commentary. Nothing more and nothing less. The fact that a medical doctor is not legally liable for giving cocktail party advice in no way invalidates all the years he spent getting his degrees, which qualifies him to be the one you go to in a formal office situation for medical expertise. Kipp is eisegeting my disclaimer to build a straw man. He is essentially emphasizing a claim I did not make. He then goes on to say, quote, Falk proceeds to look up the passage, then cautions that, quote, there's a lot of references in Deuteronomy 32 to other forms of literature, end quote, but without any further explanation about what he is getting at and why. The fact that I begin with this statement, as I am looking up the passage, of course, contradicts Kipp's claim that I knew nothing about the passage, and contradicts his claim that this was the first time I had looked at the passage, even if I did not supply much by the way of detail. Regardless of the text-critical issues of Deuteronomy 32:8, all parties admit that this chapter interacts heavily with other non-Israelite texts and myths, such as the Tananim of Deuteronomy 32:33, which is the reference to the mythical sea monster of Ugaritic myth. Theodore Lewis, CT 13:33-34, and Ezekiel 32, Lion Dragon Myths, JAOS 1996, page 39. Kipp continues, quote, from his on-the-fly reading, Falk posits that Professor Smith's argument stems from a source-critical view of the text, that the two different titles used of deities might indicate different sources behind the surviving text, Quote, I really think here that Mark is taking, say, a source-critical approach to the text, basically saying, oh, you got Elion, you've got Yahweh, it's two gods, obviously no, he's wrong here. That's just a bad reading of the text, end quote. Okay. Punctuation may be a small matter, but you can completely change the meaning of a quotation by changing the punctuation. It is the difference between let's eat, Grandma, and let's eat, Grandma. By changing a single comma, you can turn a polite invitation to dine into a homicidal act of cannibalism. And Kipp shows his complete dishonesty by manipulating the punctuation of my statement in the most deceptive light. Compare the original quote. It's two gods, obviously. No, he's wrong here. With Kipp's misquote. It's two gods. Obviously, no, he's wrong here. The former quote is an assessment of the position, while the latter is punctuated to make me seem arrogant. The video footage is clear because there is a longer pause between obviously and no than between gods and obviously, and here's the footage. Basically saying, oh, you got Elion? You got Yahweh. It's two gods, obviously. No, he's wrong here. This is exactly the sort of outrageous dishonesty I have come to expect from Kipp. It is ironic that Kipp later on accuses me of sloppy handling of sources, which was not the case, when he misquotes my words for his gain. But Kipp has no shame, only hatred. So much for Kipp's, quote, good scholarship, end quote, and, quote, desire for truth, end quote. I hope Amateur Exegete is regretting his endorsement by this point, because Kipp is making him look stupid, just like he did to Oz before him. Kipp continues, quote, we, Kipp and Dan McQuillan, both maintained that the primary issue with what Falk was doing was his apparent total ignorance of the textual issues behind this passage. And as Dan pointed out, his lack of awareness regarding what Smith has been arguing for over 20 years now. Just because I don't mention Smith's scholarship does not mean I am unfamiliar with it. The question I was asked by Swiftsea was, quote, I heard Mark S. Smith say, Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 is evidence that Old Testament religion was polytheistic because it says that the God El gave Israel to Yahweh. What are your thoughts on this argument? End quote. The question was restricted to Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 and this argument. Kipp may think Swiftsea is talking about Mark S. Smith, when Swiftsea is really talking about this one narrow argument of Smith's. And is Smith's interpretation really compatible with the passage? It is a red herring to say I didn't engage Mark Smith when I actually engaged the argument, and more importantly, I engaged the question I was actually asked by Swiftsea. Besides, Kipp is advancing an absence of evidence argument. To paraphrase him, quote, Falk said nothing about the text-critical issues or secondary literature, therefore he doesn't know, end quote. Kipp's argument is, I don't hear him talking about X, therefore he doesn't know X. This is a ludicrous argument. If someone doesn't say something, it by no means implies they lack the knowledge. Furthermore, he says, quote, My problem is much less with Falk's reading, which is admittedly minimally possible, but we will get into that, than it is with the fact he's promoting himself as an authority and providing an off-the-cuff response to a question he clearly does not adequately grasp. And here we arrive at Kipp's real objection. All this academic doublespeak is pretense for Kipp's true gripe, that I am, quote, promoting myself as an authority, end quote. This means that his complaint is really a matter of professional hedge protection, essentially guarding his turf from outsiders. However, the charge that I am promoting myself is a baseless ad hominem attack. Unlike the channel Kipp Davis, where the teaching of Kipp Davis is promoted, my channel is not named David A. Falk. My channel is called Ancient Egypt and the Bible, and my name only appears in small print at the bottom of the opening screen. If my goal has been to promote myself, then I have done such a bad job of this that many people misspell my name. For example, Dr. Falk, Dr. Falke, Dr. Ficole, Dr. Salk, Scott Stripling. Ugh, I really need to take better care of myself. This, however, doesn't bother me in the slightest, because I want the focus to be on the work, not the talking head. But Kipp says, it is obvious, just by watching the clip itself, there is no doubt that Falk is searching for answers as he is reading the text, and his response confirms that impression with aplomb. What? Kipp has the entire Old Testament tattooed behind his eyelids? What kind of exegete expounds upon a text without first reading it? I'm afraid I don't see a problem with first reading a text in English and then looking up the text in Hebrew for further clarification. Furthermore, what disgrace is there in, quote, searching for answers, end quote, from one's memory as well as the text? Kipp accuses me of both not knowing the answer and recalling it from memory. This is an adolescent contradictory argument and is about as two-faced as it gets. He continues, would it really have been too difficult for Falk to simply admit that he is unaware of the text-critical discussions surrounding this text and their implications? The irony here is that on December 28, 2021, just 5 days before his blog article, Kipp conducted his own live question and answer session. On that video, he tried a live Q&A format similar to what I do. At timestamp 1 hour, 1 minute and 5 seconds, he gets the question, quote, thoughts on condemned worship of Atharat or Asherah being the Egyptian representation of Hudshu or perhaps the Hittite goddess Asertu. While for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Kipp waxes eloquent about Yahweh reforms and Yahweh as a royal cult, he avoids answering the actual question, which is about Atharet being an Egyptian or Hittite god. Why didn't Kipp simply admit he was unaware of the ancient Near Eastern development of foreign deities? Wouldn't it have been better for Kipp to admit ignorance than try to answer this question? In that same live stream at timestamp 1 minute, 1 hour, 6 minutes, and 35 seconds, he is asked a question that should be in his specialty. Quote, why does the Septuagint in verse 7 read, pantis hoi angeloi autou, end quote. At first, Kipp thinks the question concerns Deuteronomy 32:7 and has to look up the text, then changes his mind to say it's Jeremiah 32:7 and has to look up the text to read it. Hey, I thought Kipp, as an expert on this text, never had to look things up. He then pauses to collect his thoughts with a long, okay, yeah, so, remember, end quote. If he's such an expert on this text, why is he clearly, quote, searching for answers, end quote? Then he reads Deuteronomy 32:7 from the Septuagint, a verse that has nothing to do with the question. He bluffs his way through with a discussion of angeloi soi, report to you, and its connection with angels. Then he states that there is some confusion of the verbal usage of this word, saying, quote, this doesn't actually have anything to do with so-called angels, end quote. Thus, Kipp strawmans the original question. He changes the question to something more fitting that he can answer. At timestamp 1 hour, 9 minutes, and 50 seconds, the post puts on the screen the questioner's clarification. Quote, at Kipp Davis, I'm talking about Psalm 97 or 96 in the Septuagint, end quote. At first, Kipp avoids addressing the clarification until the questioner at 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 50 seconds posts another super chat. Quote, it's about Psalm 97 or 96 Septuagint, smiley face, good attempt, end quote. So Kipp is caught red-handed, dodging the question. To this, Kipp further dodges with, quote, I'd have to go back and look, end quote. So he again has to look up the text and search for an answer, for a text-critical issue he is simply not aware of. And finally admits, quote, honestly, I probably won't be able to give you a satisfying answer here on the fly, because you ask tough questions, end quote. Wait a minute. Isn't this in Kipp's lane? Essentially, Kipp tried to bluff his way through a question and got caught. It should be apparent by this point that Kipp is holding others to a standard that even he can't keep because the bar is too high. Nobody knows it all. Not me, not Kipp, nobody. This then speaks not just to the hypocrisy of Kipp's statements, but also to the fact that he has raised the bar to a point of impracticality even for himself. Nevertheless, the hypocrisy exposes here a fundamental difference between my approach to Q&A versus Kipp's. In the case of my answers, I answered the question directly, although not completely. However, Kipp tried to deceive the questioner by pretending to answer it. Doing a live Q&A without prior preparation is harder than it looks, which is why Kipp mostly uses pre-prepared statements. Essentially, Kipp wants me to stay in my lane while he swerves across the freeway like a drunk clown. Furthermore, when I do a Q&A, I do restrict myself to the parameters of the question. Does that mean I was unaware of the text-critical issues? No. It means that I am aware that so many texts have text-critical discussions that unless that specific question is broached, I don't answer it. And even Kipp does not answer some questions on text criticism because, in his own words, quote, because you ask tough questions, end quote. In other words, not all questions have a full answer that is practical to deliver in an off-the-cuff remark. But instead of apologizing to the questioner in his Q&A, Kipp makes fun of the questioner's real name as a diversion from his own incompetence and lack of self-reflection. Yet, underneath all the scholastic crud and fake moral outrage is fallacious reasoning, a kind of black and white fallacy. That is, quote, you must provide a fully fleshed, complete answer or admit ignorance. Why are there only two options here? Cite me the magic Hogwarts rulebook for academics that demands that partial answers to off-the-cuff questions are unacceptable. Made-up rules can all too often be the source of false outrage. Then Kipp continues, quote, alternatively, if he is indeed properly versed in the scholarship of the text, why does he tacitly ignore it when furnishing an answer, proceeding so far as to accuse Professor Smith of providing just a bad reading of the text, end quote. Perhaps because Professor Smith provided a bad reading of the text, and I stand by that opinion. And Swift's question was, quote, what do I think of, end quote, this particular view by Mark Smith? It was a question about my opinion of a reading. And I don't always agree with consensus. After all, I am not a herd animal. Surely, the majority would disagree with me. Future discoveries might prove me wrong. I'm okay with that. But it is my position today based upon the data I have. Kipp also says, quote, what is so extremely problematic about Falk's approach, as outlined above, is that he will speak with equal confidence about matters in which he is an expert, as he does when he is riffing on a biblical text that he has seen seemingly for the first time. This is the moving the goalpost fallacy coupled with a red herring, sometimes called the no true Scotsman fallacy. Essentially, this fallacy is a redefinition of a defined group by adding a characteristic that has no relevance. Everyone pretty much agrees that biblical scholars are scholars who study and research the Bible. What Kipp is inferring is that, quote, all true Bible scholars have measured confidence, end quote. He is leveraging an irrelevant point as a purity test. Here's how the fallacy works. A says, quote, no Bible scholars speak with equal confidence, end quote. Then B replies, quote, Falk has degrees and publications in biblical studies, holds a research position at a Bible college where he studies the Bible, and he is a member of several professional societies for biblical studies. But he's a Bible scholar that speaks with equal confidence, end quote. And then A replies, see, Falk is not a true biblical scholar and is only pretending to be a Bible scholar, end quote. What has happened is that Kipp posited a universal, bolstered by an irrelevant subjective characteristic. The existence of my qualifications refutes that first claim. So Kipp is forced to invoke the final no true Scotsman fallacy or withdraw the point. The fact is, there may be other Bible scholars out there that speak in equal confidence that he is simply unaware of. That doesn't make them any less Bible scholars. The problem here is that there is no objective basis for Kipp's equal confidence criterion. This irrelevant criterion serves no other purpose than to change the meaning of biblical scholar. He is simply excluding people from his in-group that he finds undesirable. But then again, that is the function of no true Scotsman fallacies. He continues, quote, by providing a disclaimer after the fact to inform his audience that, quote, the answers are not even necessarily correct, end quote, but without any indication of which answers those may be at the outset, is blatantly dishonest. Who possibly knows all the mistakes they may make before they make them? Certainly Kipp doesn't, otherwise he would have to qualify his entire blog as one big mistake. The inability to foretell one's future mistakes is not being dishonest, since we are scholars, not psychics. If Kipp can predict his future accurately, he should forgo his scholarly dreams and play the lottery instead. Nevertheless, prior to this point, I have mentioned that mistakes do happen from time to time, and I am happy to correct my mistakes and correct any misinformation that I unintentionally disseminate. For example, on livestream number 4, where I mistook Khirbet Kefaya with Khirbet El Maktir. I have also said on numerous occasions, quote, don't trust anyone's word, not even mine, but test all things and hold fast to what is true, end quote. I warn people of this because we all make mistakes, even as we have seen with arrogant, hypocritical jokers like Kipp. On the other hand, I don't make a huge deal of it either. But I do see a lot of projection when Kipp accuses others of being dishonest. He continues, quote, when Falk pretends that all these things are addressed in equal measure, he is misleading his audience insofar as his own qualifications to answer half of the questions he fields. What exactly does speaking in, quote, equal measures have to do with qualifications? The two are not connected in any way. How is tone of voice or manner of expression an objective measure of qualification? It is asinine. But that's the no true Scotsman fallacy. Furthermore, he commits a second variation of the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is the related no true crossover fallacy. The fallacy is committed when one denies for the purpose of protecting one of the groups that an individual cannot be part of two or more non-exclusionary groups. Kipp is inferring that I am either an Egyptologist or a biblical scholar, but I cannot be both. So I am pretending regarding the latter. But why can't I be both? Since both groups are non-exclusionary and at the same time closely related. Again, I hold master's degrees in Egyptology, biblical archaeology, and divinity, the professional degree for pastoral ministry. If I am unqualified to answer questions on the Bible, then no pastor is qualified. The dangers of this should be obvious. If Kipp's argument has merit, it would mean every pastor could be bullied into silence because they are not an atheist and don't have a PhD in the Hebrew Bible. Why doesn't Kipp go after Aaron Ross or Oz, who with equal confidence speak about the Bible out of their ignorance? It's an absurdly subjective double standard. Furthermore, many leading scholars in biblical studies have held PhDs in cognate fields and still have done successful work in biblical studies. Examples of this are plentiful. Donald J. Wiseman, Alan Millard, Richard Averbeck, John Monson, Thomas Levy, Donald Redford, and even Kipp's bromance, Josh Bowen, who writes books on the Old Testament, even though he has his PhD in Assyriology. Maybe Kipp would speak with less measure if he had pursued more education from better schools himself. Just saying. He then advances to the second prong of his argumentation. Quote, genre, poetics, and pointless parallels. Here we get a chance to see what was rattling around in his head at the time of his Q&A video that Dr. McClellan and I were somehow expected to guess about without his say-so, but I digress. They want answers to questions nobody asked. I wasn't answering Kipp's questions. I was answering Swiftsey's and Kipp's loser sycophant's question. How arrogant Kipp must be to think that I owe him any sort of answer at all, let alone an answer to his satisfaction. Wow. How egotistical to think that every answer to every question must revolve around his whim. But I digress. He continues, I think it's worthwhile at the outset to note that this distinction Falk is drawing between higher and lower criticism in his second question is fairly antiquated. What is often the case today is that when the older terms are used, it is by evangelicals, who are dubious about the results of so-called higher criticism. In other words, of the preeminent text scholar of our day, Emanuel Tove, quote, emphasis on the antithesis between the higher and lower criticism is, however, misleading, for textual criticism is not the only discipline on which higher text criticism is based. Linguistic, historical, and geographical analysis, as well as the exegesis of the text, also provide material for higher criticism. End quote. Now, this is a brilliant example of Kipp's quote mining to mislead. He supplies a quote people think support his claim, perhaps knowing that most people gloss over quotations without reading them carefully. This is the infamous Chewbacca defense or red herring. If you read the Emanuel Tove quote carefully, you will notice that Tove's statement is not against using the term lower text criticism, but against emphasizing the antithesis. Emanuel Tove is not saying the term lower criticism is anachronistic as much as the antithesis is misleading. And I would agree with Tove's assessment with the quote used in this context. The problem for Tove is not the term lower criticism, but, quote, higher criticism, which has in the field simply become, quote, text criticism, and now has absorbed lower criticism into its repertoire. It's a bit like trying to make a hard separation between frying and cooking. It doesn't make a lot of sense because frying is a part of cooking. However, there are times when you only want to talk about frying. Besides, no mention was made of higher criticism in this discussion. So this is another straw man, an argument, or antithesis, I'm simply not making. Yet, only 2 years after Tove made this quote, he uses the term to make the same distinction I do in a 2013 paper. Quote, the improving of the text at a lower text critical level is visible in so-called harmonizations included in the Samaritan Pentateuch group, but not only in them, end quote. Emmanuel Tove, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the proximity of the pre-Samaritan Qumran scroll to the Samaritan Pentateuch, page 70. If Tove uses this term in this way as late as 2013, then the distinction and the term's use is still valid. And I agree that it is a term still current in evangelical circles because it provides an important distinction that is now deprecated in secular critical scholarship. However, many in my audience are evangelicals, and it is more important that I communicate with them than with clowns like Kipp. Because to communicate with my audience, I need to speak their language. Then again, Kipp is not a careful reader. He often misreads texts in his race to prove his prejudices. That is the earmark of poor scholarship. After all, the primary skill of the scholar is the ability to read and read carefully. He too often plays fast and loose with his reading and his quotes. Kipp continues, quote, "Given what I've seen from Falk in his brief treatments of models like the documentary hypothesis or social and religious theories of settlement period in the early Iron Age Levant, I cannot help but think that this is merely a reflection of his own faith commitment, which has significantly biased him against critical biblical scholarship." Okay, this statement assumes to read my mind with regards to critical scholarship on all matters based on some of my views towards critical scholarship, including the documentary hypothesis, and my faith commitments. His words "significantly biased" is troubling since it connotes a certainty of degree for which he has no knowledge. I'm not biased against critical scholarship. I use it frequently. However, I don't accept it naively. Since when do we as scholars simply turn off our brains and blindly follow the scholarly consensus? It is the heart of scholarship to know the consensus, but having enough brains to determine whether or not to follow it. Furthermore, everyone has biases. Kipp maintains that scholars with faith propositions have unacceptable biases. Yet, this is the Baconian fallacy, the idea that the researcher, quote, "can operate without perceived questions, hypotheses, ideas, assumptions, theories, paradigms, prejudices, presumptions, or general presuppositions of any kind," end quote. David Hackett Fisher, Historian's Fallacies, page 4. So when Kipp keeps pointing out the religious biases in other researchers, he is blind to his own particular style of anti-religious bias, which is nonetheless still a bias. Deconversion does not solve the problem of bias, since human beings have a seemingly infinite regression of opinions and therefore biases. The good news, however, is studies have shown that biases can be controlled. Fisher, page 229. However, Kipp's cognitive bias is evident in respect to the fact that he regards every religious person as if they were a mindless zombie. He continues, quote, "To be clear, the genre of the passage in question does not really have anything to do with the question at hand, which is whether or not the poem reflects a polytheistic worldview in which Yahweh was a member of a larger council of deities." And he's right. I am not reading the text with a polytheistic perspective because I don't read my views into the text. My views come out of the text. And I don't think polytheism was a part of verse 8. Now, I'm not some cloistered rube that thinks the Israelites were all monotheists coming out of Egypt. But I think the Masoretic text's Samaritan Pentateuch reading is stronger and lends itself to a non-polytheistic reading. And part of my justification for this is the fact that we are dealing with two singlets in a poetic couplet. Quote, sons of Israel, end quote, is a better parallel with, quote, sons of man, end quote. And there is less cognitive load with this because with sons of God, of the gods, you have to read back into the first singlet to add interpretive load. While that is certainly possible, it is less likely based upon the passage structure. Kipp states that genre is irrelevant to how the couplet is read. I beg to differ, and his assertions are not proof against how I reason this approach. He continues, quote, in this instance, and ignoring the much more consequential textual issues for the moment, the first of the two clauses in the Masoretic text reads, quote, when Elion apportioned the nations as an inheritance, end quote, quote, when he separated the sons of Adam, end quote, the second follows, quote, he erected boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel, end quote. Kipp's translation is very strange, and he adds extra words to the text to make it work. For example, as, apportions, and he turns the word to inherit from a verb into a noun. His translation, quote, when Elion apportions the nations as an inheritance, end quote, he moves a lot of words in defiance of the original Hebrew syntax. The verb nahal, to cause to inherit, has Elion as the subject, with the nations as the object of the verb. Nothing in the text suggests a use where the nations are being given as an inheritance. This is an interpretive reading being read back into the text to make sense of it in light of the later, quote, sons of God, the gods reading. In short, it is an eisegetical paraphrase. Likewise, quote, when he separated the sons of Adam, end quote, this is an acceptable reading, although the text literally says, when his hand divided the sons of man, end quote. But this does make me wonder if Kipp is actually reading the Hebrew, or if he's reading what he expects to find there, just like he does with other texts. He further adds, quote, is he setting the number of nations according to the, quote, 70 sons of Israel as known from Genesis 46:27 or Exodus 1:5? It is odd that Kipp's subsection title mentions, quote, pointless parallels, and then he does exactly that. Is there warrant for 70 being the maximum of the sons of Israel? Surely, by the time the passage was written, the number of sons of Israel exceeded tens of thousands, if not more. Yes, Genesis 46:27 mentions that 70 sons of Israel entered into Egypt, but that is not the only reference to the sons of Israel. We have to remember that the, quote, sons of a person in Israelite culture was more than the sons and grandsons, but also the great-grandsons, the great-great-grandsons, and so on. Every male descendant is a son. And those other verses do not always reference back to the 70 sons. Already, just before the Exodus, long after the original 70 were dead, Exodus 2:25 reads, and God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice, end quote. The book of Exodus calls the Israelites sons of Israel throughout the narrative. So there weren't just 70 by the time Deuteronomy 32 was written, but a great multitude of sons. Kipp is simply doubling down on the according to meaning for the L preposition, manufacturing an uncertainty problem where none exists. This is not the only possible reading for an L preposition. As mentioned in my reply to the second question, a dativus commodi sive incommodi, for the benefit or harm of reading, of the L preposition is likely. That is, quote, for the benefit of the sons of Israel, end quote. If we read the L preposition in that way, then it doesn't matter how many sons of Israel there are. The reading still is supported. But if one strawmans the meaning, less likely readings become more palatable. And that's what text critics are doing in this case. He continues, quote, but in any event, I do not consider the genre of the passage to be a meaningful question insofar as the history of the text is concerned. There is not much information to be gleaned from this question to improve our understanding of the transmission history in Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. Of course there isn't info for transmission history, or at least not much in genre. But we have to recall that the question that Kipp's loser sycophant was asking was, quote, so they changed them to say something completely nonsensical, right? If I am to answer a question of sense versus nonsense as a proponent of the historical grammatical method, my starting point has to be genre, because I want to know what the text means in its context, or even determine if the starting reading even makes sense. Genre establishes that the Masoretic text, Samaritan Pentateuch reading is coherent. Does this answer what Kipp was asking? Of course not. But I'm not answering his question. So by broaching the matter of genre, I am indeed answering the question I was asked, not the question Kipp wanted answered. Kipp is again demanding beef from a barbecue chicken restaurant. And for some strange reason, I don't always ask myself, what would Kipp ask in this situation? I also don't have some cosmic out-of-body experience where I try to channel Kipp. Nevertheless, Kipp tips his hand as to where he starts with the text, and that is quite revealing. Kipp has stated that the number of text variants is evidence for redaction, and that is the lens through which he views the text. He expects to find evidence of redaction in sources, and that is exactly what he finds. Shocking! Not really. It's confirmation bias. Yet, according to New Testament text critic Daniel Wallace, there are 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament, and 300,000 variants from the text history of the New Testament. The New Testament is the best preserved corpus from ancient times, and also has the most variants. More variants than even for the Old Testament. But we know from the New Testament that the number of variants was the result of the multiplicity of copies, not redaction. Why can't the multiple readings of the Old Testament be explained in the same way? And is not redaction a speculation based upon a hypothetical reconstruction of no longer existing documents that also conflicts with the evidence in the existing manuscripts? Which explanation is most likely true? Kipp then progresses to his third prong of his attack. Quote, lower bar text critical ramblings. Falk has gotten the sources right for the most part, but it is sloppy of him to designate Qumran manuscript as merely 4Q Deuteronomy. There are at least 30 copies of the scrolls containing text from Deuteronomy, and they are not heterogeneous. The manuscript in question is actually 4Q Deuteronomy J, 4Q37. Yes, Kipp is griping over the superscript J. Essentially, he's exploiting the media to find fault. The fact is that YouTube comments don't have super subscripting. It is not part of the supported character set. If I had included the J, he probably would have still quibbled that I wasn't able to superscript it, knowing that superscripting on YouTube comment isn't possible. Did this result in vagueness? Probably. However, there is only one manuscript from Qumran that preserves Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. So it is also not an issue. But this hardly qualifies as wrong or sloppy either. There is actually no harm in omitting it here because the question was fully answered. It's quibbling. Quibbling. If, on the other hand, I said one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the answer would still be correct if vaguer. So, if the question is correct but imprecise, in what way is this sloppy handling of references? Frankly, this accusation is downright bizarre. It is a charge generally reserved for published works, not a comment section reply on YouTube. And while it can apply to seriously vague references where there is doubt as to which work is being cited, here, there is no doubt. And it is seldom wielded against informal answers. But then again, when you are a small man with a grudge, no quibble is too petty. He then says, quote, "There are a handful of other excerpted manuscripts from Qumran which also contain only the song. Occasionally, along with a selection of other biblical passages, another of these manuscripts, 4Q Deuteronomy Q, 4Q44, dates to the mid to late 1st century BCE, and it also preserves a text from Deuteronomy 32:43, which clearly reflects an ancient polytheistic worldview. Here again, we have a similar text-critical situation that we have for 32, 8-9, but it is not quite the same. The Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch reads, "Rejoice, O nations and his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants." 4Q Deuteronomy Q reads, "Rejoice, O heavens and his people, and he causes all the gods to bow to him, for he will avenge the blood of his sons." And then finally, the Septuagint reads, "Rejoice, O heavens, with him, and let the sons of God worship him. Rejoice, O nations and his people, and let the angels of God strengthen themselves in him, for he will avenge the blood of his sons." Quote. We have a short reading in the Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch, a longer reading in 4Q Deuteronomy Q, and a very long reading in the Septuagint. What confuses matters in the case of 32:43 is that the Septuagint preserves both readings. A reading found in the Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch and the one found in 4Q Deuteronomy Q. It is possible that we have a case of transcriptional error in this text that caused portions of the Masoretic text, Samaritan Pentateuch, and 4Q Deuteronomy Q to be deleted, and the Septuagint to be the text that best preserves the original. However, even though I would support the all the gods reading in Deuteronomy 32:43, that doesn't establish that the author had a polytheistic worldview. This reading is still within the scope of monotheism per Michael Heiser. This is really clear from the 4Q Deuteronomy Q reading, where Yahweh forces all the gods to bow to him. That's not polytheism. At worst, that's henotheism. At best, it is monarchic monotheism. The fact is, in the ancient world, the term God was very broad. In Egypt, a god could refer to practically any non-human spiritual being, basically from the lowest imp and shadow to the highest god Amun-Re. And even in Hebrew, it can refer to human judges and authorities in some instances. Granted, these are very puny gods, but we are talking about the semantic range of words, for which Hebrew is known to have a much greater range than we find in Indo-European languages like Greek. Furthermore, I don't argue against the existence of a Council of Gods theology. I think it's definitely there in Job, and perhaps in Deuteronomy 32:43. I just don't see it in Deuteronomy 32:8. And my criticism of Mark Smith's view only applies to Deuteronomy 32:8, and the conclusion that Deuteronomy 32's worldview being polytheistic. The rest of this is just straw men. Additionally, creating excerpts is not an indication of the age of a reading in and of itself. That's reading one's assumptions into the evidence. Creating excerpts was done for a variety of purposes, including phylacteries, reading copies, and notes. Kipp's conclusions don't follow, although he asserts them as absolute fact. He says, quote, "By comparing this text to other textual witnesses mentioned below, it becomes abundantly clear that the earliest version of the song appears in this manuscript." He means 4Q, Deuteronomy, J, and Q. And that the polytheistic elements have been cleverly removed through careful editing in later editions. This is why we included in our discussion of Falk's work on Deuteronomy 32:8-9 in this manuscript, and it is once again, sloppy and negligent of him to ignore it in his more thorough written response to our objections. Okay. First of all, who says I was writing a response to your objections? I did no such thing. You make it sound like Kipp's loser sycophant was a sock account for Kipp himself, which would violate YouTube's terms of service. This is the first response I've made to your objections. I've answered the question of your loser sycophant, but I've paid no mind to your worthless objections. A little careful reading would be all that is needed to expose your straw men, misquotes, and lies. However, some of our fans have asked me to amplify upon this, which is why I'm doing this response. And no, it is not clear in the slightest that the earliest reading is in 4Q Deuteronomy Q. 4Q Deuteronomy Q supports one particular reading that is affirmed by the Septuagint. However, the Septuagint also supports the Samaritan Pentateuch Masoretic text reading also. All the manuscripts together support the Deuteronomy 32:43 as the oldest reading per the Septuagint, not the reading of 4Q Deuteronomy Q. What we have here is an example of confirmation bias. Essentially, Kipp's bias is that the manuscripts went through, quote, careful editing in later editions, end quote. So he ignores that the Septuagint confirms the reading also found in the Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch. It may be that the Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch may have removed the reading that we find in 4Q Deuteronomy Q, but that is not necessarily because it was offensive. If both readings were in the Vorlage, which is the sort of the original source text, which seems most likely, then the Samaritan Pentateuch reading may have resulted from homotelutin mistake, where the eye of the copyist jumped from the end of one haraninu, rejoice, to the next instance of the word. Similarly, with the 4Q Deuteronomy Q reading, that could have resulted from a homoarctin mistake, where the I jumped from the beginning of one word to the beginning of the next. Why blame malfeasance when incompetence will suffice? Of course, the irony is that Kipp accuses others of, quote, sloppy and negligent, end quote, work, when his own work had to be retracted because he couldn't tell that the manuscripts he worked on were forgeries. But he continues, quote, to be clear, there is virtually no manuscript support for the Masoretic text and Samaritan Pentateuch readings from before the 9th century Common Era, AD. Kipp is telling a half-truth and admits some very important details. First, in broaching the Deuteronomy 32:43 text, Kipp has opened the door to a text that preserves the Masoretic text Samaritan reading in the Septuagint, which Kipp himself admits is from the 3rd century BC. Second, while he is correct that the oldest complete manuscript of the Samaritan Pentateuch dates to the 9th century AD, manuscripts are not dated by their oldest surviving copy. And every scholar who works with ancient texts knows this. Manuscripts are dated according to their oldest readings, not their oldest copies. Let me repeat that so it sinks in. Manuscripts are dated to their oldest readings, not their oldest copies. For example, the Egyptian text, the Prophecy of Nefertiti, dates to the 20th century BC, while the oldest copy is 16th century BC. The oldest copy of Julius Caesar, Commentary de Bello Gallico, Commentary of the Gallic War, dates to the 9th century AD, but it was clearly published by 46 BC thanks to Cicero's praise of the work. It would be silly to date that latter work to the 9th century AD, even though that is the oldest copy. And this is by no means the exception to this rule of dating. Here's a list of other classical works with their earliest extant copies that are treated likewise, which I borrowed from Dan Wallace's presentation. Now, fair warning to my lay viewers. I am going to get into a lot of scholarly jargon and technobabble in order to flesh out the fine nuances that take longer than 6 minutes to answer. Kipp's previous assertion is dishonest because the oldest Samaritan Pentateuch readings, not manuscripts, were found at Qumran. From the Qumran readings, Manuel Tove concludes, quote, the very existence of pre-Samaritan scrolls accepted by most scholars is contested by some scholars, especially those specializing in the study of the Samaritans. However, the exclusive agreements between the members of the Samaritan Pentateuch group leave little doubt with regard to their close relationship to be discussed below, sections 1-2, Tove 2013, page 63. Furthermore, Tove cites specific examples where the Dead Sea Scrolls agree with the Samaritan Pentateuch. Quote, the most important observation in analyzing these 5 biblical scrolls is that the preserved fragments of 4Q Paleo Exodus M, 10 times, 4Q Exodus Leviticus F, 1 time, 4Q Numbers B, 5 times, 4Q RPA, 2 times, 4Q RPB, 3 times, include all the editorial additions and rearrangements found in the Samaritan Pentateuch in the exact same places. Tove, 2013, page 66. And then Tove makes the surprising conclusion. Quote, although the pre-Samaritan texts from Qumran are more than 1,000 years older than the medieval manuscripts of the Samaritan Pentateuch, the somewhat more defective spelling of the medieval copies reflects a typologically earlier stage in the development of the Samaritan text. Apparently, the medieval copies of the Samaritan Pentateuch derive from a copy or tradition that is older or less doctored than the copies found at Qumran. Tove, 2013, page 77. And, quote, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the pre-Samaritan texts form a firm subgroup, probably going back to a single hype archetype, that's a source text, single source text, changed in each individual source. Tove, 2013, page 88. What Tove is saying here is that based upon the fullness of the orthography, that's how right writing, the 9th century AD manuscripts of the Samaritan Pentateuch come from a copy that is older and less doctored than the pre-Samaritan readings found at Qumran. Therefore, the source copy of the medieval Samaritan Pentateuch manuscript is older than the oldest pre-Samaritan text found at Qumran. Thus, the Samaritan Pentateuch text is probably older than the readings found at Qumran, and as a result, older than the 4Q Deuteronomy J manuscript. But Kipp continues, quote, in the field of textual criticism, considerable weight is set on the earliest readings, especially when there is such a vast difference of time between the manuscript witnesses. In this case, all of the earliest manuscript evidence supports the former reading. Again, this is half true. While the earliest manuscripts are often given more weight, particularly in New Testament text criticism, a text critic would be crazy to conclude that just because a reading from 50 AD is the oldest extant manuscript, it must be the original. Text criticism doesn't work that way. And for this particular reading, by, quote, all the earliest manuscript evidence, he means 2 manuscripts. 4Q Deuteronomy J and the Septuagint, because he omits the Samaritan Pentateuch group and the Masoretic text groups as witnesses. Convenient. And his 4Q Deuteronomy Q is invalid, because if it doesn't even show itself to be the oldest reading of Deuteronomy 32:43, how can it show a polytheistic reading in Deuteronomy 32:8 to be the oldest? Moreover, Kipp argues for the antiquity of the Septuagint. Quote, the Septuagint is the form of the text that was used by the translators of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which occurred in the 3rd century BC. Well, the Septuagint is not the form of the text specifically used by the translator. It is the translation. Okay? There's some very, very sloppy language here. Okay? You have to, in order to get the form of the text that was used by the translations, you have to back translate from Greek into Hebrew. So there's some very, very sloppy language here. However, I do fully agree here with Kipp because he is dating the Septuagint according to its readings, not the oldest manuscript, which dates to the 3rd century AD. This is the inconsistency with Kipp's scholarship. He dates convenient texts one way and inconvenient texts another. And when the Septuagint reading supports a reading from the Masoretic text or Samaritan Pentateuch over the Dead Sea Scrolls, he ignores it altogether, as he does in the case of Deuteronomy 32:43. So we have a tradition that Kipp concurs with, that the Septuagint is an old text that dates to the 3rd century BC. A Samaritan text group that predates its readings at Qumran. Even the 2 textual branches of the book of Jeremiah show evidence of the readings for the Masoretic text, 4Q Jeremiah A and C, and the Septuagint, 4Q Jeremiah B and D, Emmanuel Tov, Textual Developments in the Torah, page 238. Thus, we come to a terrible conundrum, and that conundrum is that it is impossible to give 4Q Deuteronomy J overwhelming weight as a witness, because other text families also have a pedigree in antiquity. And it is impossible from the current state of the evidence to say for sure which reading of Deuteronomy 32:8 is oldest, because of the paucity of texts that exist prior to the 2nd century BC. Furthermore, Tov comments, quote, "Reliance on the age of the documents is seemingly desirable, because the closer the document is to the time of the autograph, the more likely it is that it has preserved the wording of the autograph. In practice, however, this type of logic does not hold, since certain copyists preserve their source better than others. For example, the community which translated the Masoretic text has left the biblical text virtually unchanged for some 2,000 years, whereas the Qumran scribes modernized and changed the orthography, morphology, and content of the text already in the Second Temple period, within a relatively short period of textual activity. Thus, 1 Isaiah A, dating to the 1st century BCE, is further removed from the text, source text, of Isaiah than a Masoretic manuscript written in the 10th century Common Era AD. Given such exceptional cases, the fallacy of dependence upon the age of the witnesses was recognized long ago. Emmanuel Tov, Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, page 301. Furthermore, quote, he says, this is Tov, in recent research too, reliance on the age of documents has been attacked strongly, especially by Pascali, in a chapter entitled Recontiores non deteriores. Recent documents are not necessarily worse than older ones. Tov, 1992, page 302. In short, while the oldest manuscripts might have some weight, the best, least changed texts have the most weight. And this is why it is important to evaluate the witnesses of all the text types, because stable texts cancel out old inferior texts, and because the Septuagint has more edits than either the Masoretic text or Samaritan Pentateuch. Tov, 2013, page 85. Kipp continues, quote, while text critics often speak without nuance of the 3 great witnesses to the biblical text in the Masoretic text, Septuagint, and Samaritan Pentateuch, this is conventional shorthand for a bewilderingly more complicated picture. The point being here, any attempt to draw clean lines between the, quote, branches of the text from the period in question is completely anachronistic. There is no doubt that there were more than 3 text type families, and I am not drawing clean lines between the branches. So who is making this argument? I'm certainly not. It sounds like Kipp needs to go after those other, quote, text critics that, quote, often speak without nuance. Not me. So this is a straw man. Kipp is implying that I should have made a more nuanced statement about the text families. Therefore, my view is anachronistic. Kipp is making assumptions about my view and about what I am thinking, and then runs with those assumptions as if they were things I said. Yet, while there were many text families, just like the modern concept of human evolution, where humans are said to have descended more from a bush than a tree, it is also the case that what has survived of the biblical text does fall into 3 rough groups. And modern text critics acknowledge that, which is why they name these groups to reflect that. For example, the Masoretic Text Plus or the Masoretic Text Group. And yet, text critics do recognize that there are distinctives that allow them to roughly categorize the text into these groups. And so, when we see 2 groups of texts diverge in a reading, stating that there is, quote, bifurcation of the text, end quote, in regards to a single text reading is not an unreasonable thing to say, even if the text groups are more of a bush than a branch. The very reason text critics use these conventions is so that we can say something intelligible about these text groups without descending into a bewildering morass of subjective gibberish. But Kipp states, quote, in actual fact, scholars are generally agreed that both the older reading preserved in the Septuagint and the 4Q Deuteronomy J and the, quote, obviously anti-polytheistic revision, quote, in the Masoretic text and Samaritan Pentateuch were already in circulation during the Second Temple period. However, the field is virtually, I think he means unanimous here, in promoting the priority of the 4Q Deuteronomy J reading as the original text, even while maintaining that the Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch revision coexisted alongside of it in the Second Temple period. That which is claimed to be obvious need not be necessarily so. And that is why there is general agreement and the field is virtually unanimous, but not completely. And some of the holdouts do so because the Vorlage reading is uncertain, and also because they disagree with the theoretical underpinnings that fostered that reading. Kipp states, as a result of the harmonizing tendencies observed in the transmission of biblical text, including the Samaritan Pentateuch during the mid-Second Temple period, the reading in Deuteronomy 32:8 was changed from sons of God to sons of Israel. This occurred in part as a calcification of monotheism, end quote. Now, that is an ad hoc explanation driven more by theory than evidence. Presuppositional explanations are not evidence. Likewise, Kipp's supporting quote from Zeimer demonstrates the same problem. The problem that exists in fields where the evidence is sparse, like Old Testament criticism or prehistory, is that evidence is hard to come by, and in the place of evidence, theory often fills the gap. And over time, what eventually happens is that the scholars working in the field can no longer separate the theory from the evidence. theory and evidence sort of coalesce so that the theory itself becomes accepted as evidence. He continues. So the reason the more ancient reading survives in an excerpted text like 4Q Deuteronomy J is because on its own there is no need to bring the Song of Moses into consistent alignment with the rest of Deuteronomy or the Pentateuch. That is one heck of an assumption completely without proof. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest that excerpting makes a text immune from harmonization. That is empty conjecture. For example, we know from the Enlightenment period manuscripts that books with the lightest use tended towards better survival. And those books with heavy use seldom survived. Survival of a text may not be simply because it was excerpted. Perhaps it survived because it had an anomaly that caused the copy to be removed entirely from circulation. Since this text is only a tiny fragment, it is impossible to say why it survived. But removal from circulation is why the documents in the Cairo Geniza survived. This massive, basically text dump. A Geniza was used in Hebrew synagogues when texts were taken out of circulation. They were either defective texts or they were texts that were broken down, and in, say, medieval Jewish practice, you couldn't burn the texts. What you had to do was either bury them, which was impractical in a big city like Cairo, or you stuck them between the walls of your synagogue. And this is called a Geniza. And many of the texts from that Cairo synagogue, which dates to roughly the 8th century AD, survive because they were put in between the walls. They were essentially taken out of circulation. So we don't know why that particular text for Deuteronomy, or 4Q Deuteronomy J, survived. It's sterile conjecture to suggest anything else. Kipp says, 1. The original form of Deuteronomy 32:8 read, when Elion gave nations as an inheritance, when he divided the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of people according to the number of the sons of God. End quote. This archaic reading can be seen at any point in the Assyrian, Babylonian, or Achaemenid period. It is rather odd that when a text reads, quote, according to the number of the sons of Israel, that the modern critic jumps to the junk assumption that it refers to the 70 sons of Jacob, while ignoring all through Exodus, the Israelites were also called sons of Israel. But when the text reads, according to the number of the sons of God, magically, the number of sons is no longer an issue. But we also see here a weirdness as Kipp's translation changes from, quote, when Elion apportioned the nations as an inheritance to, quote, when Elion gave nations as an inheritance, end quote. In both cases, the hithpa'al is a causative verb, not a noun or a prepositional phrase. Kipp is not translating this passage. He is reading into it. The verb is cause to inherit. The hithpa'al being the causative of the verb nahal, to inherit. The subject is Elion, and the object of the verb is nations. So, quite literally, when Elion caused the nations to inherit. Furthermore, the earliest extra-biblical attestation of Elion is the Stela Sapphire 1, circa 750 BC. So the earliest attestation of this name or title is in the Assyrian period. But even Frank Moore Cross concedes that this text is not necessarily a polytheistic epithet. Frank Moore Cross, Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic, pages 47 to 48. And it seems strange that this text is supposed to be a reference to polytheism when it conforms to no known Canaanite god. The evidence here is thin. Kipp then says, 2. A revision of this text occurred, spelling is correct, to reflect a monotheistic ideology that became more intensified in the Hellenistic period, but also to align the text more to the rest of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch. This is argument by storytelling, and a consensus agreeing to a yarn. And this is why I remain skeptical of some aspects, not all, but some aspects of modern critical method. What is the evidence for this? None. It is using the Dead Sea scraps as tea leaves to confirm a bias to see what you want in them. Kipp then also says, but to beat a dead horse, I should like to cite Ulrich's reading of the text. Quote, the Masoretic text intentionally replaces the polytheistic term just as it did the more mythic and polytheistic readings of 4Q Deuteronomy Q at Deuteronomy 32:43, end quote. So, in effect, I'm not going along with the consensus narrative that the Samaritan Pentateuch, Masoretic text, groups were redacted in the Hellenistic period. Indeed. And there is a lot of other academic consensuses that I also don't buy into. I don't buy into postmodernity or critical race theory, because today's academic consensus ends up being tomorrow's garbage. Just like black body radiation, phlogiston, spontaneous generation, and Ptolemaic astronomy. And the documentary hypothesis and all the garbage theories that come with it are headed straight to the dumpster. And it has already happened at European universities. And sooner or later, it will happen in America too, because the center cannot hold. Then, Kipp quotes Tove. Quote, in its probably original wording, reconstructed from 4Q Deuteronomy J and the Septuagint, the Song of Moses referred to an assembly of gods. Compare Psalm 82, 1 Kings 22:19, in which, quote, the Most High Elion fixed the boundary of the people according to the number of the sons of God, El, end quote. The next verse stresses that the Lord Yahweh kept Israel for himself. Within the supposedly original context, El, Elion, and El need not be taken as epithets of the God of Israel, but as names of gods, also known from Canaanite and Ugaritic pantheon. It appears, however, that the scribe of an early text, now reflected in the Masoretic texts, Samaritan Pentateuch, the Targumim, the Peshta, and the Vulgate, did not feel at ease with this possibly polytheistic picture and replaced sons of El with Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, thus giving the text a different direction by the change of one word. While I do respect Tove, even he is not immune from the presuppositions endemic in the field. First, he is resorting to a paraphrase, not a translation of the passage. It is amazing how difficult this passage becomes when one has to craft a proper, straight, non-gibberish translation when you accept, quote, the sons of the gods reading. And even Tove cannot do it. Second, concerning his statement, quote, Elion and El need not be taken as epithets of the gods of Israel, but as names of gods also known from Canaanite and Ugaritic pantheon, end quote. El is definitely in the Canaanite and Ugaritic pantheon, but the evidence is lacking for Elion. It occurs in Iron Age, say, Aramaic treaty texts. It also occurs in the blessing that Melchizedek bestows upon Abraham, Genesis 14:7. But then we would have to assume that Elion was a Jebusite name for El, which would push back the dating of these texts to the 2nd millennium BC. So while these epithets may not specifically apply to the God of Israel, the converse could just as easily be true, that these epithets could be adopted as synonyms for the God of Israel. Then Kipp says, Falk is just plainly wrong here, but instead of acknowledging his limitations in handling this text, he has doubled down by retreating to the outdated, quote, principles of textual criticism, which were popular in the first half of the 20th century. You mean acknowledging my limitations just like you did when you handled the, quote, pantes hoi angeloi auto question? Of course, what he means here is that I am doubling down with principles that are no longer used, and that is lectio difficilia potior. Quote, the more difficult reading is the strongest. A text criticism that says you should follow the most difficult reading. Now, the irony here, when he talks about my anachronistic use, is that he still follows the documentary hypothesis, an outdated 19th century hypothesis that is quickly losing its favored status. That said, however, the lectio difficilia principle may be subjective, but it is no more subjective than what is being used to determine the date of his readings. Yet we have to remember that my use of lectio difficilia was in response to the question that was given to me by Kipp's loser sycophant. And that question reads, quote, at ancient Egypt in the Bible, you know the original text of Deuteronomy 32, 8-10 says, Elion apportioned out the nations to the sons of the gods, not according to the sons of Israel, right? And that post-Second Temple Jews didn't like the scriptures, so they changed them to say something completely nonsensical, right? At least the Septuagint bothers to keep the original grammar and just changes Elion's sons into angels. The passage in the Masoretic text that English Bibles use is gibberish. Every time Kipp does a hit piece on me, I get a swarm of his idiots who don't realize what he spews is nonsense, and I have to school them. Well, this loser sycophant is saying we should reject the Masoretic text Samaritan Pentateuch reading precisely because it is the more difficult reading. Tove says, quote, however, the basic validity of the rule cannot be denied. Many scholars have recognized that the rule is nevertheless problematic and impractical since it fails to take into consideration scribal errors. Tove 1992, page 303. So the rule is valid even if problematic. And that is all I needed it for to advance my argument. The actual application of the rule was not done and wasn't necessary. Therefore, my use of the rule was restricted only to say that the easier reading is not automatically the best reading. But this doesn't answer Kipp's assertion that the rule is no longer used, only that my use of the rule is valid in this case and non-subjective. So, Kipp's contention that lectio difficilia is outdated is irrelevant, and therefore lectio difficilia is sufficient to answer whether the easier reading must necessarily be the better. Put bluntly, the actual question I was asked was answered using Lectio Difficilior without using Lectio Difficilior as a principle to make my text critical decisions. But Kipp continues, quote, the so-called principles of textual criticism, including this one, have largely been rejected by modern text critical scholars, as explained by Tove. Quote, in many instances, this rule has been applied so subjectively that it can hardly be called a textual rule or canon. For what appears as linguistically or contextually difficult reading to one scholar may not necessarily be difficult to another, end quote. But is Kipp's statement true that it has been largely abandoned? Tove doesn't actually say in the previous quote that the rule has been abandoned. He only says that that it's subjective and problematic. Tove again says, quote, in spite of the remarks in the introduction of the HOTTP, the Hebrew Old Testament Text Project, there are probably no established rules of internal evaluation on the basis of biblical context, and most external evidence relating to the nature and age of the translations and manuscripts is irrelevant. The rules of evaluation to be used, mainly that of the Lectio Difficilior, have the appearance of objectivity, but they are often impractical and their employment subjective. Emmanuel Tove, Textual Basis of Modern Translations of the Hebrew Bible, page 100. We can see from Tove's quote that the principle is being used by the translators of the HOTTP. Furthermore, Tommy Wasserman, editor of TC, the Journal of Biblical Textual Criticism, states that Gordon Fee used the Lectio Difficilior principle as late as 1981, and Wasserman argues for the longer reading of Luke 10:41-42 based on that principle in his abstract. Quote, in this article, I argue that the long reading in the passage of Luke 10:41-42, where Jesus replies to Martha that, quote, few things are necessary, or indeed only one, end quote, is the initial text and the Lectio Difficilior, as well as the text that is best suited to its narrative context in Luke's Gospel, end quote. Tommy Wasserman, Bringing Sisters Back Together, another look at Luke 10:41-42, page 439. He also states, quote, unfortunately, Syme's presentation of external evidence is deficient, and she does not clearly argue in favor of any reading, acknowledging that there is a wide variety of opinion among other scholars about which reading is the Lectio Difficilior. Wasserman, page 458. If Lectio Difficilior is such an obsolete and outdated principle, how then can this leading text critic not know that? If the principle is obsolete, why is there, quote, a wide opinion among other scholars, quote unquote, arguing over which text is the most difficult if the entire notion is moot? Perhaps the principle is subjective, but that is not the same as it not being used. Clearly, Kipp needs to read more. Kipp continues, quote, but even granting Falk the usage of his outdated approach to this text, it must be stressed that all other considerations are not equal. The manuscript evidence is overwhelming in favor of prioritizing the reading of the passage preserved in the Septuagint and attested in 4Q Deuteronomy J. This Qumran manuscript is far and away the oldest witness to this reading. and its survival outside the Book of Deuteronomy and its standalone copy of the Song of Moses reinforces its antiquity as demonstrated above. Kipp is essentially using only the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint as witnesses based upon the method that has been discredited since the 18th century AD. Tove, 1992, page 301. So this turns out to be a purely subjective assessment since it gives no weight to the stability of the manuscripts. Kipp fails utterly to show that the older reading is the superior and covers this with forceful assertions. Maybe this is the original reading. Maybe it's not. However, it is possible that it is not older than the early Samaritan Pentateuch group text, given the rapidity of change in the Qumran readings. Kipp then states, quote, even if we grant the principles for the sake of salvaging the late redaction in Masoretic and Samaritan Pentateuch, they are inapplicable because the manuscript evidence is so definitively on its own. It is such a strange view to orphan ancient texts in this way. He is saying that other manuscript text types are of little to no use, despite their antiquity, because he has one text with a reading he likes. He has a manuscript from AD 50 and thinks somehow this trumps text groups that are at least contemporary, if not older. If every text was treated that way, we'd be saying that Julius Caesar followed Charlemagne. Junk method ends up in junk results, and this is the proof. And then he says, so Falk's reading here provides a decent explanation for the meaning of the edited passage, so long as we ignore the problems in his translation. Well, at least mine was a translation. Kipp doesn't actually point to any problems with the actual translation. He points out reasons why one might not use the edited passage in the Masoretic text or Samaritan Pentateuch. But that's not the same as spelling out a translational problem, whereas we have shown that his translation is not a real translation at all, but more of an eisegetical paraphrase. The point of a translation is to take what is there in the actual Hebrew text and convert it accurately into English. He did know that, right? Kipp adds, quote, but again, it adds no insight at all into the developmental history of the text itself. Besides, we might point out here that by his own outdated employment of the principle of lectio difficilior potior, this particular reading could be disqualified as the original for being less unusual. This is, of course, an example of precisely why scholars have abandoned these arbitrary and subjectively so-called principles. Again, I'm not actually using lectio difficilior potior to determine which reading is best. If you read my comment carefully, I actually left unsaid why I chose one reading over the other, because I had a sneaking suspicion that Kipp would try something like this. So I left something unsaid as bait. Clearly, Kipp has never heard of a box canyon ambush. It's when you lure an opponent into a canyon, then attack him in ambush style from the high ground. I used the valid aspect of lectio difficilior potior without actually endorsing it as a principle to be followed, only stating that the easier reading is not automatically the better one. The real reason I chose the reading I did is that I just happened to favor, in agreement of principle with Tove, more stable texts over weaker texts. Kipp is nothing if not predictable. He then says, and this is a problem. because most of the questions that Falk fields comes from nervous evangelicals who are concerned about the problematic history of the Hebrew Bible. How does Kipp know that most of the questions I field are from, quote, nervous evangelicals? How does he know that most of my subscribers are evangelicals? And what special insight does he have of their psychological state of mind? Is this a scholarly opinion? Since when did he become a clinical psychologist? This is not a statement of scholarship. It is a statement of prejudice. It is a polemic. And this blog of Kipp's is not scholarship. It's a hit piece. Any pretense that Kipp's blog is scholarship should be immediately tossed out. Are you hearing me, Amateur Exegete? Basically, Kipp is telling the world that you shouldn't listen to me and I should shut up about the Bible because I'm a non-Bible scholar who is out of his depth and who attracts those nervous, insecure evangelicals, which would include fundamentalists and other non-denominational Christians. Fortunately, my subscriber base is much smarter and diverse than that. The fact is that only about half of my audience falls into the broad catch bucket of evangelical, fundamentalist, non-denominational, or independent churches. The other half of my audience is composed of non-evangelicals, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, High Church Anglicans, etc., and non-Christians. Yes, you heard that right. A substantial portion of my audience are non-Christian. Of those who are non-Christian, 10% of my audience, 3% are Jewish, 3% are other religions such as Muslim, neo-pagan, etc., and 4% are atheist, agnostic, or non-faith practicing. I'm sure that last group would really appreciate being thrown into that bucket of nervous evangelicals. Furthermore, of the evangelicals who do watch my channel, only 18% describe themselves as nervous about their faith or needing the bravado of other people. This means that only 10% of my viewers are so-called nervous evangelicals. 10% hardly constitutes most. That's 1 out of 10 of my viewers. Kipp's assertion is just plain wrong about my audience. Kipp paints with a broad brush over the majority of my subscribers that are not nervous evangelicals, and many of whom have nothing at all to do with evangelicalism in the slightest. No one appreciates being misrepresented, and my subscribers are no exception to that. Nevertheless, let's say 100% of my viewers were so-called nervous evangelicals. Would that make their questions less valid? What exactly is the problem with them going to someone with faith to answer their questions about their faith? Where do nervous atheists go for their answers? Let me think. I don't know. Perhaps other atheists like Kipp? Nervous evangelicals deserve better than the question-avoiding ramblings of a washed-up vindictive clown. Kipp then says, they depend upon his bravado to bolster their own insecurities about difficult topics, like the documentary hypothesis, slavery, polytheism, and the origins of Deuteronomy and the propagandistic Deuteronomistic history. They are emboldened by his hand-waving and casual disregard of the voluminous and intimidating consensus of scholarship on these matters. Kipp's opinion and disdain really shines through here. Quote, "Look, you evangelicals are so insecure that you need Falk to embolden you about difficult topics, like the documentary hypothesis. And you are so stupid that you won't submit to your betters and simply accept the world of consensus scholarship, which is the only legitimate opinion." Wow. The condescension here is staggering. Look, just because a theory has voluminous and intimidating scholarship behind it does not make it right. And history is full of examples of such theories. For example, every physician knew ulcers are caused by stress, and knew you can't cure cancer using the stimulated T-cell anti-tumor response. These are two scientific consensuses supported by voluminous and intimidating consensus of scholarship that have been overturned just in our lifetime. While I think that the consensus needs to be seriously considered, I don't think we should be a slave to it either. Moreover, my subscribers are not emboldened by my bravado, hand-waving, or casual disregard. Perhaps a small number is encouraged by my approach. However, if empty disregard was all there was to my teaching, my subscribers are sophisticated enough to see through that in a heartbeat, and they would have me for lunch, and rightly so. They are smart enough to realize that there is substance to what I say. They are emboldened because they see that I am not afraid of you. You are a pathetic, bitter clown who comes off of a bender, walks onto a schoolyard still wearing your costume, empty bottle in hand. The kids start to laugh, and you fly off in a rage, swinging your bottle, and the kids run away frightened. And all it takes is a grown-up to stand up to you, and instantly everyone sees right through the makeup. And the best part is the more you keep riffing on my stuff, the more they'll be emboldened. It keeps the popcorn maker busy and spikes my subscriber count. Fantastic. He concludes, "In short, stay in your lane, Dr. Falk, and leave the biblical scholarship to actual biblical scholars." Overall, Kipp's blog is a hit piece, promoting an elitist ideology where only people without faith can comment on the Bible. He does this by strawmanning his adversaries, using fallacious reasoning, and misquoting his sources in the most outrageous ways. It is a nightmare world where neither pastors, nor priests, nor Christian Bible scholars, nor even you can comment on your faith. Kipp says I should stay in my own lane. Why should I? So I can let a vicious clown who cannot even get his bumper car into first gear terrorize other drivers on the road? I think not. Anyway, that is my response, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Thank you for watching.